growing population in the city. So I mentioned, a few reasons why we're updating the plan, but a few key issues I want to talk about today as we segue into our missing middle housing discussion is one, the inequities in land use that were developed through the previous plan weren't really addressed in the policies and how it was spelled out within ForwardDallas 2006. So one missing piece of that particular plan is that it didn't develop a future land use map. So a future land use map provides clear guidance in terms of where and how the city should be developed and grow over time. And the purpose of doing that is to provide clear predictability for developers, residents, and those other stakeholders in the city. Secondly, provide a clear path for neighborhoods to understand how their visions and plans get integrated into the city. That's another component that wasn't clearly defined, and we wanted to make sure we do that through this process. So with our conversation today, we're going to be talking about housing and land use and why that's important that we think about those two together. So like I mentioned before, we are expecting an influx of people into the city. So we need to think about how do we plan for that increased growth. Concerns about affordability, justification, displacements are all issues that are very real in the growing city. So I want to make sure we're talking through those particular issues with all the departments in the city to help us plan well and think intelligently how we think about land use in the city. And then thirdly, we want to look at the ForwardDallas and housing plan and how those intertwine with each other, especially with providing more housing options into the city. So as we think about that, housing and land use, we're going to delve today about missing middle housing, kind of defining what that needs to look like, what the terms are, and talking about how ForwardDallas can think about that particular type of housing within the city.
All right. Hi, everyone. So as Lawrence mentioned, we're going to be discussing what is missing middle housing. And so the official term, the official definition, it is a range of house scale buildings with multiple units, compatible in scale and form with detached single family homes located in a walkable neighborhood. And Daniel Paralick, I hope I'm saying that correctly, he coined this term. And this is the infamous graphic below that really illustrates what missing middle housing is. And as you can see, there some of the most common ones are the duplex, fourplex, townhouses, triplex stacked. We live, work type of environment here in Dallas. And so these are just some examples of what missing middle housing is. Ultimately, it's diversification of housing types. And the goal is with these diverse housing types, it would create some affordable options. And so through ForwardDallas and our land use efforts, we want to explore what new housing types could be introduced here in this area. And again, it's just properly scaled housing integrated within existing neighborhoods. And so you have the cottage court, a side-by-side duplex, stacked duplex, fourplex, sixplex, excuse me. And then some of the other housing types are eightplex, courtyard, the townhouse, and the live, work environment. So I want to be clear what it is not, okay? Missing middle housing. This is not an across the board rezoning of all single family areas. It's not a process to eliminate single family zoning. And this is not a process that will lead to incompatible housing types being built in our existing single family areas. We know that compatibility in our housing stock is key. That is something that we've heard many of our residents say during this Forward Dallas process. And so we are keeping that in mind, and that is the goal. So I want to take this time to just briefly highlight some of the benefits of missing middle housing. We know that we have different types of residents all across Dallas. For example, I'm a millennial. I am currently single, living alone. And so a single family house may not be the best choice for me at this time. Currently, I'm in an apartment complex. But if there was an option to purchase something that I had ownership at the same size of an apartment complex, I would love to do that. And so one of the things Missing Middle talks about is affordability by design, having these different homes where it's walkable. So walkability obviously is a key here, and having access to some amenities. But the point with the affordability component is you're providing a small yet spacious residence for people, and it's still low cost, but really good quality construction. And the next thing that's a benefit is reduced transportation costs. And again, when you have that walkability component, there may not be a need for a car, or if there's some transit options available, like the DART station, you can utilize that. So that's what they mean by reduced transportation costs. There's some shared land costs, smart land use, and the income, equity, and empowerment. And so really what I want to highlight today is the smart land use component, since we're all about land use here at Planning and Urban Design. And I'll touch on the equity and empowerment piece as well. So here you have a graphic. This diagram shows just a different number of housing units and how it can fit within a residential building layout. So this dimensions illustrate 6,250 square foot lot. And so not to get too technical, let's think of within City of Dallas, we have a zoning designation R75, 7.5. So that's a 7,500 square foot lot. And so this image shows, hey, you can have the same lot. You can put one single family home on that lot, or you could do 2 units and design it like a duplex. You could go up to 4 units, like a quadplex, or you could go up to 8 units. So that with the 8 units, you have a smaller multifamily unit or smaller apartment. And so it's all about the flexibility to fit on these small lots or infill lots, which are undeveloped or vacant lots in otherwise developed locations. And so I know I can provide a quick example, like in South Dallas, there are some vacant lots and there's some infill development going on currently. But we want to make sure that that development is compatible with the existing homes in the areas throughout the City of Dallas. And also with missing middle housing, this gives small residential, this provides an opportunity for businesses, smaller scale developers, minority developers, to come in and build a excellent product that would serve the residents of Dallas. Oh, okay, go back. Okay, so briefly, I did mention I want to touch on the equity piece, and I'll just say this because it looks like that slide got left out. The whole point of missing middle housing is that it's accessible to all different groups of people. And so you have this entry level purchase cost, which would be less than a single family home. And so with that, various different incomes can have the opportunity to live in quality housing and build equity while doing so. Many people may not know this, but with federal home loans, you can purchase a home that has up to 4 units. And so if you're able to do that with that option being affordable to you, you could live in 1 unit and then rent out the other remaining units. So that's just the options that are available within missing middle housing. Okay. And so go back one more slide, please. Again, just want to make it clear that these are just various housing types that we're looking at. Nothing is set in stone. Just wanted to remind you all that this is what it is. Okay, so here are some examples. This is the duplex, and these are just images of more modern style of duplex, but you also see some traditional homes as well in duplex form. And so as we look through these, just keep in mind, you know, what would work in your neighborhood. Okay, and this is the triplex. Again, different housing types, different design elements. Doesn't necessarily have to be the modern big box. It can be something that fits the characteristic of your neighborhood. And so one of the things that we're working as a collaborative team with planning and urban design and housing is to produce a style book that can work within City of Dallas, that works for our neighborhoods, that gives the design elements that are compatible yet affordable, and will blend and integrate in the existing communities. And so that's fourplex. And obviously these are various different styles of fourplex, but just wanted to show some images so that you all have an idea of what it is. And last but not least, one of my favorite styles is the townhouse. And so this is actually here in Dallas on Canton Street. And there are townhouses all over throughout Dallas. This is just my favorite set of townhomes. You have the nice sidewalks with the trees, it's walkable. So yeah, so that is just a brief overview, high level of what missing middle housing or neighborhood scale housing is. And so Lawrence is going to tie this back into land use with place types in ForwardDallas.
I appreciate that. So as we kind of go back and look at different tools and what ForwardDallas is looking to do, again, the land use is a big component, a major component of ForwardDallas. How can we think about providing more housing accessibility through land use? So what we have on the screen just shows some of the tools, planning tools that exist to help to increase housing accessibility. The first two are what ForwardDallas are covering from a land use perspective and community engagement and coordination. The other two, zoning and code amendments, those are things that are going to happen after ForwardDallas with other tools and other processes that are going to also include some community engagement. So what we want to focus on too is what we're doing with ForwardDallas, and what we're showing on the screen is basically a quick transit, a quick kind of cut through of all the different types of places in the city that represents the major land use mixes that exist throughout the city of Dallas. And within each of those place types, they're going to talk about and define how different types of housing could be integrated and allowed to provide this increased housing accessibility throughout the city. So it's key that we look at the city again. City of Dallas, I think the majority from a land use perspective, land use is single family residential. So it's important that we look at those places in the city and think about what barriers can we reduce for developing more types of housing that doesn't destroy neighborhood fabric, but also just provides more flexibility for developing more housing in the city. So like I mentioned before, we're going to be getting a lot more people into the city, so we have to plan proactively about that. Every community is going to have to look about how does new housing look like in my community. It's going to look different from traditional residential neighborhoods to some neighborhoods in the downtown core. Looking at those different suite of options that Lizzie showed within that middle tier of missing middle housing, that's what we're looking at to think about and integrate with what we're developing with ForwardDallas. So talking about engagement, on the screen, we have several tools and locations of engaging the project team. So the first one is our ForwardDallas website, where we have information about ongoing events, updates to the process, and also just materials that we develop through this process. You can be notified through email by the second link. And then we have an interactive map that's going to be live basically the entirety of the process, where you can provide comments on a particular map in areas that you either live or you work or you're interested in related to not just land use, obviously not just housing, but how that kind of ties into other aspects of ForwardDallas, how we're looking into economic development and environmental justice, to name a few. So with that, we're going to transition the bulk of our time for conversation and discussion with those in the audience. So I believe for the back end, if you have a question, if you could raise your hand, then you would be allowed to unmute. Also, if you have any questions through chat, we have a back end staff that will be answering those questions and pulling us to those for us to listen to. And anything that we don't get to touch on today, we'll try to respond back to you through email or through a Q&A that we'll provide on our website. So I think first, I think Billy Lane has her hand raised. Thank you for joining us. What questions do you have for the group?
Thank you all and the incomparable Sandra Bowie for putting this together. This is good information. So on a 50 by 125 lot, you showed a graphic. My question is, how many units? I mean, if I do, I don't know, stacked duplex, stacked trop, how many units reasonably am I talking about?
So you talk about particular like square footage. You said something about 50 by something. Okay.
Yeah. If I had a 50 by 125 lot, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, so to be honest, I wouldn't be as familiar with the number of units per kind of lot. It would really depend on the zoning, the location that you're building, and the community that you're building close by. So I think generally, when you're looking to add more, I guess, more housing per a lot like that, that's going to depend on how high you can build as well. So I wouldn't be able to give you a number, but I think I want to speak to your question that are you looking for a particular place in the city that you're trying to develop, or just thinking about what you will be able to develop from a housing perspective?
Well, yeah, we build in the Mill City area, and in fact, we have some lots that we've set aside for this middle housing issue. And so I'm just trying to think, make projections. Obviously, thinking about making some projections. So we have a series of lots that are 50 by 125.
Right.
So
right.
I'm pretty sure we can go up. I think in our neighborhood, there's some examples of 2 and 3 story. And so I'm just trying to really reasonably think about how many units total could I get. Let's say I had 3 lots that were 50 by 125 and I could go up. I mean, just best guess, how many units could I get out of that?
Right, so I'm actually going to defer to one of our staff members who's actually more familiar with that on the call. I think Patrick Blades, let me know if you're available to talk through that particular example.
Yeah, Mr. Lane, so this is Patrick Blades. I'm with Planning and Urban Design. So it's going to be kind of an equation, but it's going to be based on 2 things. It's going to be the context sensitive nature of that development. Again, missing middle housing is supposed to be something that you walk down the street and it looks like it fits in with that community. The other part is going to be the size of those units that you're going to put in there. Because if you have that 50 by 125 lot, you can easily put one, you could easily put two, three, four, you can easily fit that many on that lot. But again, it's going to be reflective of, okay, I've got my 4,000 square foot structure. What's that breakdown of the number of units that are going to go in there? But again, that missing middle, context sensitive, you're not gaining a lot of height usually. 2 to 3 stories is usually the tallest that you're going to get with the missing middle stuff. And then that's just a breakdown of the square footage for the lot and the style of units in there.
Yeah, I think last thing too, the zoning aspect, that's not our purview. I think that will also determine kind of how far from, particular setback line you can build. And there's also other restrictions that I'm not too familiar with on our team, but I think that would also provide more kind of direction in terms of that. So I think related to that particular example, we'd be open to kind of coming in and talking about development properties that you have, and that's just getting all that information, all the staff that knows those particular perspectives. That's probably the best way to go about kind of understanding what you can build and developing that area.
We'd love to have you come out, take a look. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome, definitely. I appreciate it. Any other questions? Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it. Looks like Kevin Clapp, I believe. Let me see. I think
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead. I think I might probably read out of order. So after that, I think Leon Davis and then Ross Allen. So go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, apologies. I came in a little late. I just wanted to ask, would the missing middle housing, would that be allowed under single family and detached zoning areas?
So I think there's a few things we're looking at too with the development of the place types. So the idea is to have all different parts of the city allow more flexibility for adding different types of housing. So it's going to look different for each community. So like Patrick mentioned, it's context sensitive. So I think in residential neighborhoods, it might be things about, how do we add or think about adding more flexibility to maybe either add like an ADU or something specific like that. To that type of housing type. In other parts where it's denser, types of townhomes, duplexes, kind of more co-op type of housing. I think it's gonna look different too, but the idea is to make sure we're adding additional availability and accessibility to housing in a way that's context sensitive. So I think in residential, single family residential, yes, but it's gonna look different than it is in other parts that have more blended type of residential stock.
Okay, so to just verify, you're saying within something that's context sensitive, missing middle housing could in a way be something that can be used in the traditional residential neighborhoods that make up a majority of the city currently, as far as a place type. Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. So Leon Davis.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
When you were when the presentation was taking place and was talking about missing middle housing, it stressed the importance of it being accessible to all income level of people. One of the things that since I came on board with the city, working in eco dev, that I struggle with is how the incentives are managed here in Dallas. When you start talking about community and stabilizing communities, I agree, missing middle housing is extremely important, but it's very attractive to a certain classification of people, being the middle class and the upper middle class, the heavier tax bracket, the tax burden individuals and families within those income brackets. And so having the abundance of middle class and upper middle class sprinkled within the community stabilizes the community is very important in terms of home ownership. But the way the incentives are applied here in Dallas, it discriminates against that income level, because when you start talking about affordable housing, a lot of those families don't qualify for those programs to even buy the property. For instance, when I came down here to find an apartment, there was a specific apartment in the farmers market area that I wanted to lease. And I came just to see that one unit that they had. And as soon as I walked through the door, the guy didn't ask me my income or anything. He just told me flat out, "You're not going to qualify for it. You're going to make too much money. I can't show it to you." Um, what I'm seeing on the housing, for affordable housing, people are running up against that same obstacle here. When you start talking about home ownership, how do you create that middle housing, utilizing the incentives, understanding that the very people that is going to be most attractive to are not going to be able to qualify to purchase that unit in terms of home ownership.
Right.
And so
Oh, sorry.
what
Go
I'm
ahead.
seeing is the builders are not even building for that classification of people. But when you look at the population, the breakout of Dallas, especially the south areas where, a friend of mine came here during the same time I came here from Bentonville. He had to push all the way to Mansfield to get a house because he couldn't live in Dallas. So how do you address that challenge in this? My understanding is it's a council initiative, and it came up in a briefing today. Councilor West brought it up about the importance of it, but what steps can we take to kind of make some concessions to build towards those income levels as well?
No, I appreciate that. That's actually a really great question. So I think there's two pieces that you touched on. I'm going to touch on one of them or two of them. So the first piece you mentioned, affordable housing, kind of the programs that the city kind of develops for this for residents in the city. Those are kind of focused more toward those higher risk individuals who are close to not having housing. Those are typically where those programs are geared toward. But you also mentioned something about housing, affordable housing for the middle class. And I think that's the majority of what we see now in the city. And what we, as a plan urban design, what we're over, what we kind of control, we're not really over the housing kind of programs. We're more about land and land use. So what we can do, what we're talking about is how do we provide the existing land stock that we have? How can we develop policies and think through providing more opportunities for more housing in those particular in the land that we have in the city. So one, if we keep the current way that land is developed, single family, multifamily, if those particular types of regulations are in place and they stay the way that they are, they're going to perpetuate more inequities in terms of people being able to afford housing. So we need to think about how do we add more flexibility to the land and the policies that allow for more types of housing in these types of, in the lower density or even with higher density. How do we add more flexibility for other income brackets, specifically the middle income, to have more opportunity for housing? So that's what we see is that, okay, the land that we have in the city is a set area. Instead of growing out like other stakeholders are doing, they either go out to the suburbs, exurbs, get housing there, or if they want to stay in the city, we need to think about how do we update the land use policy that exists to increase or develop more people to come into the housing, either through renting or ownership. What we're seeing too is that the majority, I think it's about 40, not the majority, I think 46% to about 60% of city residents actually rent their residence. And when you start to kind of increase that percentage, it becomes actually very expensive to increase or keep that price point kind of affordable. When you go the opposite direction, though, when there's a lot more people having housing that they're owning, and it's above that 60% as well, that also becomes very hard to create that price point that's affordable. So kind of that middle price percentage between 40% and 60%, if we're able to keep renters and owners around that, we can kind of keep that affordable. But what the issue is that we have a certain stock of land. So we have to think about how do we add the accessibility to what we have, that's through adding the options to provide more, townhomes, triplexes, duplexes. I think that's the key that we're trying to see is how do we add language to our existing policies to allow more options for housing. That's what we're looking for. So right now, the options, the suite that we have, there's not too many options from a land use perspective, and that's all that we can control from ForwardDallas. What housing is looking to do is kind of think about, okay, with the policies that they do have, although it's focused on a particular class that's more at risk, how do we help with creating more policies that allow more people to be part of that? Looking at the text as well, just to make sure I covered that question. I mean, Leon, excuse me, are you still on the call? Should we have a follow-up or anything? Okay, I'm gonna go to the next person. If you have a follow-up, please put down in the chat. We'll come back. Ross Allen.
There you go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, perfect.
So my question is, when talking about this missing middle housing, if and how mandatory parking minimums are discussed. I mean, there's plenty of evidence now and research that shows mandating parking spaces increases cost, it decreases walkability, which are two of the main goals here. I actually really liked a lot of the diagrams in the presentation because there weren't a lot of garages in the pictures, which I thought was a huge plus. So I'm curious, like, if this is something that's actively discussed when you all are thinking about this missing middle housing, you know, building these duplexes with fewer or maybe no parking spots at all, and all these other types of developments, if we can, you know, across the entire city, or allow lots of variances, or make it easier to apply for variances to get rid of all these mandatory parking spaces. So yeah, that was my question was about mandatory parking minimums and how that could help this missing middle housing.
Yeah, so our current planning team, kind of led by our assistant director, and Andrea, she has actually led that development of the parking reform, thinking about what tweaks need to happen with our code to allow either less kind of stringency with parking from not just a residential perspective, but kind of all over the board, from retail, residential, apartments, and the like. So I think we're looking through that piece in terms of the code and zoning piece. So after ForwardDallas, what's going to need to happen to actually implement some of these suggestions? So that's definitely on discussions, and we're thinking about that with our current planning team.
I just want to add that with the parking, yes, Lawrence mentioned it's an ongoing discussion. When we think about the missing middle housing, and collaborating with our housing department, at least with the different lots that the city owns, we're exploring those design guidelines to determine, you know, some may have parking garages, some may not. We know that, you know, various people like parking garages for numerous reasons. But thank you for commenting on that aspect of it, reducing the parking and designing homes in a way where you don't have to have all of this additional parking.
Right. Now, that only makes sense when you're actually by amenities or a structure that you can actually walk to. So I think that's the way that a lot of North Texas cities are built, kind of, it's car dependent. So I think thinking about, if we're going to do that, how do we build a community that's actually self-sustaining, you can walk to, you can go get some groceries, et cetera, and you're not dependent on a vehicle to get all those things.
Yeah, and I think there's even been studies that shown, I mean, developers, if you take away the parking minimums, it's not like developers stop building parking. It just allows them to build less. So, you know, if it is going to be in a Frisco type city, then they're still going to build parking. So Anyway, thank you for answering. I appreciate the information.
I appreciate the question. Thank you. All right, next, I see Courtney Spellacy. Hey, Courtney.
Hi, Lawrence. I have my question in regards to the role of missing middle in the Ford Dallas update. So I understand that the Ford Dallas update does not address zoning. And if the idea behind the missing middle housing is that it can occur as infill development and detached single family neighborhoods and that kind of a thing, so those land uses or areas are already designated for residential use. So how does one register support for more missing middle housing if that really is more of a zoning issue in terms of being allowed to have duplexes in certain areas or quads or things like that?
No, that's an awesome question. So with ForwardDallas, the core of what ForwardDallas is doing is providing a guide or guidance for zoning. So the way what we want to do that is make sure that we know that increased housing needs to happen in the city, but how it happens in each individual community is going to look different. So the idea of ForwardDallas is to kind of come and kind of think about how different communities would like to incorporate additional housing within their communities. Have that as policy within ForwardDallas, which kind of talks about the guidance of how each community should be increasing housing. And then when it gets to the zoning perspective, when the zoning ordinance updates or when the zoning changes occur, they look to ForwardDallas to understand how that housing should be being increased in that particular area of the city. And that's going to influence the zoning pieces and the zoning changes that occur. Because at the end of the day, zoning is the policing tool, and ForwardDallas, the comp plan is more of the guidance and the visioning tool. So before you kind of start to police a particular direction, you kind of have to have that direction first. So this is kind of what we're doing now with the community, getting feedback in terms of what they individually want their communities to look like and grow like. So then when we get to the zoning perspective, they know how to enact that policing tool to implement those particular changes.
So on the place type maps, do
Mhm.
you actually comment on support of missing middle housing and those place types? Because if it's residential,
Right.
it could already be assumed that that was available there or that you could put that there. So how do you note that support
Right.
in this phase?
Yes. No, it's a good question. So like each place type is going to have a description about what it's wanting that community to feel like. In addition to the description, it's going to have
Okay.
kind of a matrix or an idea of the different types of land uses within those place types. There's going to be an urban design component that talks about where those types of land uses, housing options, et cetera, should be located, so corridors, buffers of the city, buffers of the community, of the district. So that each place type is going to designate and kind of talk about how that fits within the place type. And additionally, kind of showing that on a map, having a map that kind of helps identify where contextually those things also need to be looked at or addressed or not applied, just depending on where it is. So I think all those things come into play when we start to look at what the place types are saying, where it's located, the different types of infrastructure that it's by, and the priorities that are existing within each of those place types and communities. So that's how we're looking at about this, is using the place types and the maps and where it's located to help determine and provide better guidance whenever it does get to the zoning side of things.
Got it. Thank you.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. Let me go back to the chat. Harry Swanson.
Yeah, I'm just curious in your presentation, and you're going from the book Missing Middle Housing, you don't mention anything about cottages, ADUs, which he has a whole chapter on cottages and cottages courts, and that would be tiny houses. You know, you could put tiny houses. And you don't mention anything about ADUs, which could go on somebody's piece of property. That's in chapter, he brings that up in the chapter 7. And you don't mention anything about manufactured housing, because you could stack things and come in there. You look like you want to build things instead of bringing manufactured housing is the most inexpensive housing out there. So I'm just curious, in Forward Dallas, are you going to allow cottages, tiny houses, ADUs, which is all in the book of missing affordable housing?
No, yeah, so I think the graphic that we showed is just like a quick snapshot of that literature. I think all of those options are all on the table for developing and thinking through how do we increase accessibility to housing. So I think you just listed all the other housing types that we're definitely considering and thinking about adding and thinking and defining within each of these place types. So we're not excluding any of those within Forward Dallas. I think most just want to focus on this for graphically and thinking about that middle perspective in terms of housing that exists in the city. Like a lot of people who right now probably can't afford to buy a new house or single family house. But there's this middle kind of perspective that we're looking at in terms of not just missing housing from a type of perspective, but also the middle class, the different types of housing that exist. So I think you just touch on the whole suite of housing options, and we just want to kind of show graphically for illustration purposes, but not limiting to just the ones that we share.
What can I sort of follow up? Monty Anderson has done a house down, where he has 4 people living in one house. Do you know Monty Anderson?
No, but go ahead.
What he's come up with a concept, and I think Forward Dallas should look at it. He lets the one individual buys the house, and he's developed the house where they have 4 different entrances into the house. And the individual owning the house rents the other bedrooms out to other people. So that helps him pay off the house so he, can have a home. Have you looked into housing like that? Because all of a sudden you have 4 people living within one house sharing resources, and the one individual is getting equity out of it from the rent.
Right.
So Monty Anderson has a very good idea how you could go into existing houses and divide up into rooms and share services, and you're using an existing building.
Right.
Have you looked into? I think you need to go down and talk to Monty Anderson.
No, I think, yeah, the examples you provide, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think from our perspective, just making sure that the land use provides opportunity to do just that. So you just talked about different ways of kind of skinning that cap from housing affordability perspective. We want to make sure that we are doing a good job of providing the availability and the opportunity to do exactly that type of creative kind of housing situation that can exist in the city. So I think, yeah, if you wouldn't mind kind of putting that in the chat, we can definitely use that to kind of continue to do our research in terms of what could be implemented post Forward Dallas. I appreciate that.
House is down near Bonton Farms, so it's already in the southern sector.
Awesome, thank you. That's a good example.
Mhm.
And then just see time check. So I have 10 minutes. I think we have time for a few more questions.
Was Ross Allen?
We have Hexel and then Carnell, but let me know if Shalonda back in if I missed anybody. But I see Hexel as being the person next on here. I think we talked with Ralph.
Hi, Lawrence. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I have 3 simple questions that I'll string together for the sake of time, but I will spare a few seconds to say huge props to the comments from Harry about Monty Anderson and from Ross about parking. If they hadn't said those things, I would have tried to say it myself about that guy and this policy. And also wanted to touch on ADUs. So I have some logistical questions. I'll string them together. First, testing of my understanding. My understanding is that individual districts, either at a district level or a neighborhood level, can opt in or opt out to ADUs. So the first question is A, is that my understanding correct? B, assuming my understanding is correct, what would be the process for initiating opting in our neighborhood? And then the third question is, do we have a finite list of the districts or neighborhoods that have opted in to allowing ADUs? Because it's a question that I've started getting, because I talk about housing all the time. And so I've started getting questions like, okay, I want to build an ADU. Can I do it? And I actually don't know, because I can get their district, but we don't know whether or not it's allowed in their particular street or neighborhood. So 3 questions. Is my understanding correct? If it is correct, how do we opt in? And then who has opted in so far?
Cool deal. Now, thank you so much. I think that question would actually hand that over to Patrick Blades, who has a little bit more familiarity with the ADUs and how it's working in this city.
Yeah, so for that ADU overlay, a community can opt into that ADU overlay or make it a part of a conservation district or historic district or other zoning implement. Or an individual property owner can apply, and this is the regulations right now for the city of Dallas. So as we're talking through Forward Dallas, we're talking about making changes to that process. But right now the process is an individual homeowner can do it, or a community can do it. A neighborhood can come together and say, we want to opt into a ADU overlay. They can do that if they already have a conservation district or historic, or they can just create an overlay for that ADU process. Right now, and I'm going to double check this, but I'm only aware of one community who has opted into that overlay process. That's in East Dallas, off of Lower Greenville, and I can follow up and get you the specific regulations that they went through and the process they went through to allow that community. And it's a couple of streets closer to the M streets that have opted into that area or have opted in to overlays or ADUs. It's a part of specifically their conservation district regulations. And then we can also follow up with that process of how you would go about if a community or neighborhood decides they want to create that overlay. It's a process of engagement, gathering signatures, getting that sign off to say that the community wants this, as opposed to just a couple of people on one street want it.
Okay, cool. I don't want to take up too much time because I know some other people probably have great questions. So I really, really want to get that follow up. So the only questions I'll ask to nail things down is A, when we say that the community, so understanding it's an overlay, my instinct is that the overlay can be any boundary. So it doesn't have to be the entire district or even an entire tract or whatever. Like the boundaries of the overlay can be according to whoever comes forward to make the petition. And the second question is, if I go onto the City of Dallas zoning website right now and look at the overlays map and scroll through the maybe hundreds or so overlays, are you saying I can find an ADU overlay somewhere in there?
So the 2 answers to that question. So yes, the creating that area, we can talk through the different ways in which that area could be created. But again, this is also about Forward Dallas and thinking about how to open up that process so it's not so restrictive. And then there should be, and you can double check that our GIS team has an ADU overlay, but there's not going to show up any overlays because the only area that's opted in did not do it through an overlay, but instead added it in as part of their conservation district regulations.
Oh, okay. So is this Lakewood? Well, I don't want to get that. So in a nutshell, if a neighborhood or a certain set of residents wanted to do this, I know the process in Forward Dallas is to refine this process so it's more accessible. But as it stands now, the process is get an overlay, even though no one has gotten an overlay yet for ADUs.
So the process would be you can go about getting an overlay unless you already have an overlay, like the conservation district or historical districts. Those act as an overlay, or if you had a PD in the area. And so basically, if you're not straight zoned, you can change whatever that process is, the conservation district or historic district, to allow that. Or if you are just a neighborhood that's R75, you could create an overlay that would then allow ADUs for whatever area, community, or district that you want to allow them in.
Gotcha. So does this mean that technically speaking, the ADUs are only allowed in that one conservation district in the entire city of Dallas, and no one else is allowed to have ADUs at this moment?
No, so there's only one area that has specifically worked after the ADU ordinance. And that's that one area closer to the M streets. But there are other areas of Dallas that have a form-based code or different codes, different PDs that would allow ADUs as well. And that's where we just need to pull a couple of those areas and get that information. There's some
Okay.
areas in South Dallas where it would hypothetically be allowed as well.
Okay, so other than the conservation district, every other neighborhood that has ADUs got so because of an a la carte statute in the PD ordinance.
So I'm going to follow up with you offline about that one because I want to make sure that I'm concise with the answer.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you so much, Axel. So we have time for one more question, and then we will wrap up today's Lunch and Learn. So, Carnell.
Hey Lawrence, how are you?
Good, how you doing?
Doing pretty good. Thanks for this webinar today. I think a lot of the questions really touch on how difficult it is to incorporate this type of housing into cities, and Dallas particularly has struggled with this. I think ADUs is one of those examples. And so I have kind of two questions. One is, what is going to be planning and urban design and the city's approach to incorporating this into Forward Dallas and then into zoning successfully? And then you also mentioned that this is an opportunity for us to kind of offer feedback. And so for the people on this call and for other supporters of missing middle housing, what feedback do you need from us?
No, awesome question. So I think the first question in terms of how ForwardDallas is going to be kind of integrating some of these different options, what we're looking to do is through these place types, which is kind of the core of the land use planning perspective for ForwardDallas. We want to be able to specifically say what each of these place types are going to be providing in terms of options from missing middle perspective and other perspectives about how they're going, those particular place types are going to be addressing missing middle housing. So if we're looking at ADUs, talking about through the language, how we want that particular place type to incorporate and think about what ADUs look like in those type of communities, and et cetera, with other place types. So it's important what we're going to be doing is as we start to update the place type map that we have online, those are going to have updated descriptions. They're going to be asking the community to also provide feedback for our team to develop and think through those descriptions related to how we're thinking about these topics, touching on those points. Because what's going to happen from that particular place type descriptions, that's going to lend and lead toward the zoning piece, which is actually going to be policing and getting those things to be actually on the ground in terms of how CPC members, community members, developers actually implement some of those visions, those ideas that the place type description is going to be talking about. So going to the second question was about what do we need from the community to help us to develop this? The core thing that we're going to be asking is going into that map, going into your areas of familiarity, where you live, where you work, and providing feedback in terms of one, do those place types resonate and make sense in terms of what it's describing is going to occur in your community? And two, if there are any disagreements, providing us with those comments in terms of, hey, these comments don't do X, Y, and Z, they can improve, or they could be a different place type, or et cetera, for us to kind of go back to the drawing board with our consultant, refine the description and provide that back to you all for more further analysis. So what we're trying to do is every month, we're updating that place type map, we're updating the descriptions, and having the community provide feedback to that as we go toward hopefully trying to get something more refined and drafted in the summertime. Yeah, touching your question, Carnell, let me know.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, awesome.
Okay, and I'll just add, for our next upcoming Lunch and Learn will be April 18th. And that will focus on urban design. So those of you all that had questions about more design and parking and access to amenities, you'll want to be sure to tune in with our colleague Arturo, and Lawrence will be on that call as well. So thank you all so much for tuning in today. Lawrence, did you want to add anything?
No, just thank you again for the conversation, the questions. I think the core of these lunch and learns is not just for us to kind of share information, but to kind of hear what the community has to say, the questions that you all have for us, and how can we think about answering those questions through Forward Dallas. So all incredible questions. Thank you all for those who provided that through chat and through audible methods. Please, if we don't read in touch on your questions, please feel free to reach out to us through email at pud@dallas.gov, or you can reach out through our website and the other tools and locations that we mentioned on the presentation that's on the screen. So again, just thank you all so much for your time, and looking forward to the next lunch and learns that we have that we provided links to as well.
Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.